Now I have loaded in just a photograph of some rocks where we have a lot of shaded areas and shadows showing up. And this photograph has not been converted into a seamless texture because in this case we would want to perform the shadow removal before making the texture seamless. If I just go ahead and set this up the way we had it before, using the lighten mode for our blend and offsetting this, now we can see the seam showing up, of course, because that hasn't been modified. But for the most part, because there are so many variations of brightness and shadows showing up within this texture, it's going to be difficult to use the same texture in order to cover those areas up. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that layer. So what we want to do is remove the shadows from this layer and have a similar texture underneath it. And that way we can blend those together and fill in those zones. And this is the texture I'm going to use for the base layer. And I just have this loaded in. What I'm going to do is hit Control A to select all, or you can go up to the top menu, hit Select and All, and I'm going to hit Control Copy or Control C to copy, or we can go to Edit and Copy, and either Edit and Paste or Control V in my case, just to paste this into our document. Now we need to make the background layer an active layer we can edit. So if I double click on the background, we can give this a name. I'm going to call this Rocks Main. And now I'm going to move this above the layer 1, which I'm going to rename Base Rocks. Now these two textures are the same size, taken with the same camera, so I don't need to make any changes to the scale. If you were using a seamless texture that you want to have as that base layer, you would just need to make sure that it fills in the entire background. So the easiest way to really remove these shadows, I'm going to select the Rocks main layer, and if I go to the Magic Wand tool, or you can hit W on the keyboard if you're using the default shortcuts, what we're going to do is select our shadows and basically just delete them from the layer. And it's normally a good idea to set up a new document for any sort of texture when you're modifying the photograph so you don't lose that original photograph. So what I'm going to do is go to the history, and on the bottom we have the ability to create a document from the current state. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and it's going to give the document name basically the last command that was used, which was accessing the layer properties or renaming. So now what we can do is close out these other images, and now we have something that currently isn't saved. You can go ahead and save that out, and that way you're not overwriting the original source image. Go back and select our Rocks main layer, and with that Magic Wand tool selected, we need to set our tolerance, which we can see up at the top. Now I currently have mine set at 30, which should be good to select our shadows. We also want to make sure that we're not using a continuous selection. If I turn on continuous and select one of the shadows, what we would have to do is hold down Shift and go through all of the specific areas we want to remove. If we turn off continuous and now select a shadowed area, it's going to select all of our shadows and everything that is like the selection. Now that can sometimes cause problems, but in this case we have a good enough contrast between the shadows and the rest of the texture where it's not going to cause any problems. Although I do want to refine the edge of our overall selection. So what we can do is either go up to the top and select Refine Edge, or you can right mouse click with the magic wand tool still selected and select Refine Edge. Using this tool will give you a couple of different options. You can view the original image, or you can set up a mask on top of the image. So we can set the color by double clicking just on the icon. You could change that to whatever it is you feel makes it easiest to see. And then what we can do is adjust the radius of our selection that we're editing. So the initial selection we have isn't going to be modified greatly, but what we have the ability to do is refine this selection. So we can smooth out the areas if we see we have a lot of disturbances. We could feather the edge if we want to, and we can see that does make a rather large change. I'm going to go ahead and reduce that. And we could increase the radius of the sample that we're modifying, contract, expand. We could also go through and look at the actual mask. Anytime you could also hit X on the keyboard in order to show the image, which would be also the same as turning off the preview. So you can just hit X to quickly see the image and work with whatever mode is really easiest for you. This mask mode will allow you to really see the edge you're modifying along with the area that's being cut out behind that mask. So once we have our selection refined, we can click OK. And because we have a little bit of a larger image, it might take a sec to process the information. And once that's ready, what we can do is just hit delete. Hit delete on the keyboard, and all of that shadow information is removed. Now, if you find that you didn't remove enough shadows, or that edge selection wasn't quite what you were expecting, you can always go to your history and go back in the steps and delete them. What you could also do is create a copy, kind of have a backup layer. All of that can tend to make file sizes a little bit larger. We also have some half-shadowed areas within this texture. So if we want to remove those as well, we could go ahead and select them rather than having to edit them and make any more modifications to the image. We could select that, hit delete. And now without the edge refinement, we can really see a lot of distortion when we deleted. So I'm going to delete the clears from the history. I'm going to reduce and go back to our magic wand. We can deselect either by right mouse clicking, go to deselect. I normally just hit M on the keyboard to go to the marquee tool, click. Just a quick click will deselect, and then hit W to go back. Sometimes that could be a little bit quicker if you're used to using the keyboard shortcuts. What I'm going to do is reduce our tolerance down to 10. And then we can select those shadowed areas. We might need to increase that a little bit higher, maybe up to 15. And then we can reselect the shadows. So now I want to refine the edge. And the settings I had before will be more than enough. So we can click OK, and that will go ahead and process, create a lot cleaner of a cut. And what we can do is delete that. And if you need to increase the tolerance more, depending on the texture you're working on, in this case, probably should have increased it a little bit more, but we're just going to stick with this for now. We do have some holes showing up in some of the rocks, but the layer we have underneath is really going to correct a lot of that. So now the main thing we can see is that our colors are completely different between these two textures. So how do we get this to blend a little bit better? Well, what we can do is select our base rocks and the base rock layer, and I'm going to go ahead and turn off just by clicking on the eye the rock's main layer so that we can really see what's going to happen to this full layer. What I'm going to do is choose Image from the top, Adjustments, and Match Color. We can then select the source document, which is our layer properties named from our history state that we created the document in. And now we can choose the layer we want to match to, which would be our rock's main. And now it's going to match up our color to blend with the rock's main. There's a couple of other options you can use. With that layer, we had some very large red pieces, and that would give it a reddish hue overall. If we hit neutralize, then we can get a more consistent tone and color. Go ahead and click OK. Turn that back on, and now we have something that matches much better and really blends together well. Now, if you want this to blend even better, maybe create a little more of a transition between the two textures, what you can do is double-click on the rock's main, and since we didn't use a mask, and we've gone ahead and just deleted that information, we have transparency. So we can turn on the drop shadow, and I'm going to remove all of the distance, set our distance to 0, and we can increase our size, and then adjust the opacity. And you can see we have a little bit of a better blend between the rocks. Now typically with the color map, you wouldn't want to make it very drastic because one thing we're really trying to do is remove the shadows and any sort of depth that is created by direct light. This would be more of an occlusion of light building up in the darker parts of the surface, and really this does look better overall, having that little bit of shadow. Now, instead of using the multiply mode, which is the default, you could change that over to color burn, reduce the opacity amount whenever using color burn compared to multiply, because it's going to be much more of a drastic effect. And you might get something that blends a little bit better. You could adjust the spread to reduce the overall fall off and the size. So there's a lot of different ways we could blend this together. But it looks a little bit better now than it did before without the effect. Just a nice little simple transition. And because these layers are separate, we can also modify the seamless texture and the offsets separately. Because in this case, we wouldn't even need to really modify this layer, the base layer, that much. So provided the overlay is correct and we don't have a lot of that texture around the edges, we won't really have to make too many modifications. So in this case, we want to modify the rock's main layer first, make that seamless, and then see how it's going to look with the base rocks underneath it. You could also add other layer styles to this. I would not use the inner shadow just because we don't have information outside the edges of the document. And with inner shadow, what we're going to notice is a darkening around the edges of the surface. So when we go to tile this, things aren't really going to match up correctly. And this won't take into account any sort of offset or seamless texture amount. So using the inner shadow might not be the best idea unless you add information to the outside of the layer, but basically you would already have to have your seams missing, and you'd have to copy and paste and connect those together. But once again, that's something you'd want to avoid, especially with a color map. If you're working creating a displacement, then maybe you want to use the inner shadow to separate that. Couple other options we could do are changing the color. We could make those more of a flat gray with a little bit of a yellow hue. And that doesn't really match up to the background anymore, so we'd have to modify that as well. But if you want to even out the color a little bit more, that's a really quick and easy way. It's just turning on the color overlay, setting that blend mode to color, and then choosing your color. And of course there's other blend modes you can use to mix with the color to make it a little bit better. But that does give us a nice little balance if we want to use it. So in this case we were able to set up two different layers to remove our shadow first before we would go ahead and remove those seams, which I'm not going to be covering. But what we would do is offset just this base layer first, and then we can start to connect our texture around the edges. And with that base layer underneath, we get a lot more flexibility, and we'll be able to create a pretty cool texture out of that. So we can see the original image and with all of the dark shadows, and then with that removed.